The first light of dawn filters through the dense canopy of an ancient forest, illuminating the dew-heavy leaves of a simple yarrow plant. To the untrained eye, its feathery green foliage might seem like just another wild weed. Yet, crushing a single leaf releases a sharp, camphor-like scent, a volatile oil recognized for centuries as a traditional styptic. This woodland is not merely a scenic backdrop, but a vast living pharmacy. Beneath the towering oaks and winding undergrowth, every root, bark, and blossom holds a specific ecological purpose and potential human use. The forest speaks a complex, forgotten language of chemical compounds and seasonal rhythms, offering nutritional sustenance and historical remedies. Stepping into this environment is an immersion into an ancestral repository of botanical wisdom. Here, boundaries between human survival and the natural ecosystem dissolve into seamless interdependence. Today, modern society often walks past these profound natural resources with a pervasive condition known as plant blindness. A commuter might brush against a patch of nutrient-dense stinging nettle or step over a resilient dandelion, completely unaware of the rich historical context and survival value these species once provided. This daily disconnect represents a quiet amnesia, severing the intimate bond that once tied human life directly to the soil. There is a gentle, lingering sadness in this modern alienation, a sense that we are wandering through a grand library where the books are glued shut. The nutritional sources and traditional remedies our predecessors relied upon now grow unnoticed in the margins of our concrete world. We have traded tactile knowledge of the earth for modern convenience, leaving humanity impoverished in its sense of ecological belonging. Yet, this forgotten wisdom is not permanently erased. It simply lies dormant. Early humans evolved in continuous dialogue with these ecosystems, relying on meticulous observation to distinguish life-saving sustenance from lethal poison. Every successful identification of an edible tuber or soothing botanical was a hard-won victory, etched into the collective memory of early communities. The relationship between human beings and the botanical world is an unbroken history. This historical continuity reveals that the ability to read the landscape was the foundation of human survival. By paying close attention to subtle variations in leaf shape, the timing of a bloom, and the preferred soil of a specific root, our ancestors developed a sophisticated living science. This was an active, deeply engaged way of life, representing a legacy of resilience built entirely on an intimate familiarity with the wild earth. The practices emerging from this deep observation are categorized into herbal foraging and wildcrafting. Herbal foraging involves the broad, opportunistic gathering of wild food and herbs from the surrounding environment for immediate nutritional or practical use. It is the act of walking through a meadow and gathering wild garlic for a meal. This foundational skill allowed early populations to supplement diets with vital, localized nutrients that cultivated crops could not provide. Wildcrafting, by contrast, is the specific, intentional, and highly ethical harvesting of plants primarily for medicinal, spiritual, or crafting purposes. This practice demands deeper ecological fluency, requiring the harvester to know the precise time of day, season, and life cycle stage when a plant is most potent. It is a disciplined approach governed by strict rules, ensuring that taking from the land never depletes the local population. The preservation of this intricate botanical knowledge required highly structured systems of oral transmission. Without written encyclopedias, ancient cultures encoded vital survival data into elaborate stories, rhythmic songs, and complex mythologies that could be easily memorized. A song might describe the exact number of petals on a medicinal flower, while a traditional myth served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of a toxic look-alike. Elders served as living libraries, tasked with the critical responsibility of ensuring this botanical fluency was accurately transferred to the youth. The training was immersive and practical, requiring years of guided observation in the field to verify that a student could flawlessly identify plants in varying weather conditions. A single mistake could prove fatal, making the accuracy of this oral tradition a matter of absolute survival. This profound botanical fluency directly shaped the trajectory of early human migration across the globe. As nomadic groups moved out of familiar territories and into entirely new biomes, their survival depended on an ability to rapidly decode unfamiliar plant families. Foundational skills of observation and testing allowed them to identify new sources of carbohydrates, vital vitamins, and natural fibers for shelter in previously unseen environments. The successful navigation of these botanical frontiers enabled early societies to establish thriving populations in environments ranging from freezing tundras to sweltering tropical latitudes. By mapping the flora of each new region, migrating humans unlocked the resources necessary to build localized cultures, develop specialized tools, and establish early trade networks. The global spread of humanity was a massive triumph of applied botanical science. Across this vast global expansion, indigenous communities developed hyper-localized knowledge systems perfectly calibrated to their environments. In the arid deserts of the American Southwest, traditional gatherers understood the precise seasonal windows to harvest nutrient-dense mesquite pods and prickly pear cactus. Thousands of miles away, in the dense expanse of the Amazon rainforest, complex societies mapped the traditional uses of countless vines, tree barks, and canopy epiphytes. The towering cedar forests of the Pacific Northwest provided not just materials for shelter and seafaring vessels, but profound cultural touchstones woven deeply into the identity of coastal peoples. In the windswept highlands of the Andes, communities cultivated a profound understanding of hardy tubers and high-altitude herbs that could withstand freezing nights. These diverse landscapes were carefully observed territories where indigenous knowledge systems thrived in harmony with local ecology. Central to many localized traditions is the philosophical concept of plant teachers. Ethnobotanical records illustrate that numerous indigenous cultures viewed plants not as inert, exploitable resources, but as sentient elder kin possessing distinct agency and wisdom. In this worldview, the flora of the earth are recognized as original inhabitants, beings that have perfected the art of living in a specific place over millions of years. This perspective fundamentally shifts the dynamic from extraction to relationship. When a plant is considered a teacher, the act of gathering becomes a dialogue rather than a transaction. Traditional healers often speak of receiving knowledge directly from plant spirits through deep observation and prolonged periods of quiet attention in the wilderness. The botanical world is understood to possess a conscious intelligence, communicating its properties to those who demonstrate necessary respect. Viewing the natural world through this lens of relational ecology fosters a profound psychological and spiritual connection to the environment. There is a deep reverence in approaching a forest not as a storehouse of goods, but as a community of living relatives. This emotional depth ensures human interactions with the landscape are rooted in profound gratitude and mutual obligation. The harvester remains acutely aware of this powerful bond of reciprocity. This subtle reverence permeates every aspect of traditional ecological life, transforming the simple act of gathering into a sacred responsibility. It cultivates a worldview where every footstep in the forest is taken with mindful intention, and every harvested leaf is acknowledged as a sacrifice made by the plant. This profound respect acts as the ultimate safeguard against greed, ensuring that sustainable living preserves the delicate balance of the ecosystem for generations to come. This respect translates into physical action before a single leaf is severed. Historical accounts across indigenous cultures document a consistent procedural step preceding any harvest: the ritual of asking permission. A wildcrafter does not simply walk into a grove and take. They approach the target plant, stating their intent and explaining the human need necessitating the harvest. This deliberate pause forces the gatherer to consciously acknowledge the living organism before them. Following this request, the protocol almost universally requires an offering. Depending on the region, this might involve leaving a pinch of tobacco, pouring water, or offering a song. This tangible exchange is a physical manifestation of reciprocity. By leaving something of value behind, the harvester participates in an energy exchange, ensuring the gathering is a negotiated agreement between human and botanical worlds rather than a one-sided extraction. The practical ecological consequence of these mandatory rituals is significant, requiring a deliberate pause, an explanation of intent, and a physical offering for every plant inherently slowed down the pace of collection. It becomes logistically impossible to clear-cut a medicinal grove when each extraction demands a dialogue and material sacrifice. This built-in friction acted as an organic regulatory system, naturally limiting the scale of any foraging expedition. Because the harvester was culturally bound to take only what could be respectfully requested and properly compensated for, overexploitation was engineered out of the process. The spiritual framework translated directly into an effective conservation strategy. Treating the ecosystem as a collection of sovereign entities rather than an inventory of inert resources ensured the long-term abundance of local habitats. While intertwined with spiritual philosophy, these practices were not merely mystical folklore. Beneath the language of plant spirits lies a rigorously tested framework of environmental observation. This body of wisdom, recognized by modern researchers as traditional ecological knowledge, or tech, represents a sophisticated form of applied science. It is an empirical system built not in laboratories, but through continuous experimentation in the field. The survival of ancestral communities depended entirely on the accuracy of this knowledge. If a generation misidentified a toxic berry or misunderstood the growth cycle of a winter root, the consequences were severe. Therefore, the botanical data passed down through oral traditions had to be exact, peer-reviewed by the harsh realities of nature, and constantly refined by daily observations. Central to this empirical science is the mastery of phenology, the study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena. Indigenous knowledge systems functioned as complex phenological calendars, mapping the timing of the natural world with precision. Ancient foragers observed subtle shifts in temperature, the arrival of migratory birds, and the blooming sequence of wildflowers. These events served as a living clock, dictating the precise moment a species was ready to be gathered. This timing was critical because a plant's chemical composition changes drastically throughout its life cycle. Traditional ecological science understood exactly when a root's medicinal compounds were highest, typically in late autumn after the aerial parts had died back. Conversely, they knew the narrow window in early spring when a specific leaf was tender and safe to consume before it developed bitter, defensive toxins. Locating these materials across vast wildernesses required an extraordinary ability to read the landscape at a granular level. Wildcrafters navigated by deciphering microclimates, analyzing subtle variations in soil moisture, sunlight exposure, and elevation. They could look at the slope of a hill or the density of the tree canopy and accurately predict what hidden root systems lay beneath the surface. Every environmental variable provided a vital clue. A key technique in this navigation was the tracking of indicator species. Ancient herbalists knew certain common plants or fungi reliably signaled the presence of rarer medicinal herbs. If a specific moss thrived on the northern side of a hardwood tree, it indicated the exact soil acidity required for a delicate woodland flower to grow nearby. By following these biological signposts, foragers efficiently located scarce resources. The direct consequence of this observational science was the development of extensive, hyper-local pharmacopoeias. Because the knowledge was tied intimately to the specific ecology of a region, traditional medicine cabinets were built entirely from the surrounding dirt, bark, and foliage. A community living in a high-altitude desert possessed a vastly different botanical repertoire than one residing in a temperate rainforest. Each system was perfectly tailored to the local environmental conditions. These localized libraries of wild-crafted materials were comprehensive. They contained remedies for acute injuries, treatments for seasonal illnesses, and daily tonics designed to fortify the body against the specific stresses of the local climate. The nutritional and medicinal needs of the people were met by the very ecosystem they inhabited, creating a seamless loop where human well-being was inextricably linked to the botanical wealth of their immediate territory. The culmination of this careful tracking often took place in the seasonal harvest camp. During peak collection times, entire communities temporarily relocated to specific ecological zones, transforming quiet meadows into bustling centers of botanical processing. The air in these camps was thick with sensory details. The earthy scent of freshly unearthed roots, the sweet fragrance of drying blossoms, and the pungent aroma of crushed leaves wafting through the smoke of smoldering fires. This environment was a hive of communal effort. Elders directed younger generations working side by side, stripping willow barks, weaving drying racks, and sorting mountains of green foliage. It was a time of intense labor and cultural transmission, where precise techniques of plant preparation were passed down while hands were busy at work. The harvest camp was the vibrant heart of traditional herbalism, where raw nature was transformed into sustaining medicine. Within these camps, a clear technical distinction emerged between foraging and wildcrafting. Historically, foraging primarily referred to gathering wild foods for immediate caloric intake. It was the daily practice of collecting berries, nuts, and edible greens to sustain immediate energy needs. Wildcrafting, however, was a specialized discipline focused on the long-term preparation and preservation of medicinal plants, requiring a much more rigorous set of protocols. The mechanics of wildcrafting demanded careful timing and specific environmental conditions to ensure active chemical compounds within the plants were not destroyed during processing. A wildcrafter knew a medicinal leaf gathered for winter use could not simply be tossed into a basket and forgotten. If bruised or exposed to excessive heat, its properties would vanish. Wildcrafting was as much about the science of stabilization as it was about the initial harvest. To achieve this stabilization without modern technology, ancient herbalists developed highly effective methods of curing and storing their harvest. Documented techniques reveal a sophisticated understanding of chemical degradation. Volatile oils and delicate cellular structures are easily destroyed by ultraviolet light. Consequently, traditional wildcrafters constructed specialized, shaded drying sheds, ensuring potent herbs were dried slowly by ambient air circulation, strictly away from the bleaching rays of direct sunlight. Other materials required intensive curing methods to unlock or preserve their benefits. Certain dense roots were hung high in the smoke of hardwood fires, a process driving out moisture and coating the plant material in antimicrobial compounds, preventing rot during damp winters. Additionally, many fat-soluble plant medicines were immediately infused into rendered animal tallows or heated plant oils, creating stable salves that sealed active ingredients away from oxidizing air, preserving their efficacy for years. The intricate methods used to dry and cure medicinal plants were meaningless if the source was destroyed. Transitioning from the mechanics of processing to the act of gathering reveals a set of strict, non-negotiable rules governing all traditional wildcrafting. Historical accounts from the 19th century, detailing the practices of Anishinaabe gatherers in the Great Lakes region, illustrate that harvesting was never a free-for-all. Instead, it was bound by ethical frameworks designed to ensure human use never led to ecological depletion. These frameworks were not merely philosophical suggestions, but absolute survival imperatives woven into cultural law. A community relied entirely on the recurring abundance of its local ecosystem, meaning overharvesting was tantamount to self-destruction. The strict rules of ethical harvesting functioned as the ultimate safeguard, dictating exactly when, where, and how much could be taken from the wild. Central to this ethical framework was a mathematical restraint often referred to as the rule of fractions, or the 1 in 10 rule. Before a single leaf or root was taken, a gatherer assessed the entire localized plant population to determine its overall health and density. The practice dictated harvesting only a minute fraction of what was available, often leaving 9 plants untouched for everyone gathered. This calculated restraint was specifically designed to protect the strongest, most vigorous specimens, known as the mother plants. By intentionally leaving the largest and healthiest individuals to go to seed, ancient foragers ensured the genetic resilience of the patch. This mathematical approach guaranteed the plant community could effortlessly recover from the harvest, securing future propagation for generations to come. When a plant was selected for harvest, the physical act of removal was executed with precision to stimulate growth rather than inflict harm. Regenerative harvesting relied on specific cutting techniques tailored to the biology of each species. When gathering medicinal bark or leaves from shrubs like elderberry or willow, wildcrafters cleanly snipped specific lateral branches rather than breaking main stems, a technique actively encouraging denser, bushier regrowth. Similarly, the extraction of roots demanded a highly selective approach to preserve the life of the organism. When harvesting perennials like echinacea or osha, a skilled gatherer carefully dug around the base to take only the secondary lateral roots. The primary taproot was left completely intact and safely covered with soil, allowing the plant to heal over the winter and thrive again the following spring. The direct consequence of these precise regenerative techniques was the unintentional mimicry of beneficial natural disturbances. In a healthy ecosystem, plants evolve alongside stressors like the browsing of deer, the scratching of wild turkeys, or the light damage of a passing storm. The selective pruning and soil aeration performed by human gatherers perfectly mirrored these natural ecological pressures. By mimicking these disturbances, human intervention actively triggered a biological response that promoted greater plant vigor. The slight disruption of the soil surface during root harvesting created ideal micro-environments for new seeds to germinate. Instead of degrading the environment, this careful interaction actively increased localized biodiversity, making the ecosystem more robust than it would have been in the absence of human foragers. Carrying out these meticulous practices required a deep, enduring sense of responsibility from those who walked the forests and meadows. Traditional gatherers understood their own health and survival were intimately tied to the ongoing vitality of the land they tended. This was not a burden, but a sacred duty, fostering an emotional landscape where every harvest was an act of reverence rather than a transaction of extraction. This heavy weight of stewardship cultivated a culture of immense care where the gatherer acted as a guardian of the ecosystem. The emotional connection to the land meant a wildcrafter felt the loss of a declining plant population as a personal and community failure. It was this deeply ingrained sense of ecological empathy that kept the rigorous rules of harvesting intact across countless generations. This culture of care was anchored in the foundational principle of reciprocity, a concept that fundamentally defined the ancient human relationship with the natural world. Reciprocity was the clear understanding that taking from the earth required actively giving something back in return. Historical records of the Coast Salish peoples in the Pacific Northwest demonstrate this exchange was not merely symbolic, but a practical, mutualistic partnership between human and habitat. Under the principle of reciprocity, the dynamic shifted away from a parasitic drain on natural resources to an active, regenerative exchange. The forest provided medicine and sustenance, and in return, human beings provided labor that enhanced the growing conditions for those very plants. This mutualistic relationship ensured human presence was a positive, contributing force within the broader ecological web. The physical actions of this reciprocity were evident in the daily routines of traditional wildcrafters. Documented historical practices reveal gatherers routinely engaged in acts of wild tending, such as carefully replanting the root crowns of harvested plants to ensure they would sprout anew. When gathering seeds or berries, a portion was always intentionally scattered into favorable, nutrient-rich microclimates to expand the plant's territory. Furthermore, wildcrafters acted as selective weeders, removing aggressive, competing vegetation from around vital medicinal plants. By clearing away debris and reducing competition for sunlight and water, gatherers actively engineered a higher survival rate for the species they relied upon. These small, continuous acts of giving back guaranteed a stronger, more reliable yield for the ecosystem and the community. The massive historical consequence of this reciprocal tending was the gradual creation of anthropogenic landscapes across the globe. Over centuries, the subtle, continuous interventions of wildcrafters compounded, fundamentally altering the composition and distribution of plant life. What appeared to be naturally occurring patches of medicinal herbs or dense stands of fruit-bearing shrubs were often the direct result of intentional human design. These anthropogenic landscapes functioned as vast, decentralized forest gardens, meticulously managed for maximum biodiversity and yield. When early European explorers first encountered these environments, they marveled at the seemingly wild abundance of the land. They failed to recognize this breathtaking fertility was not the result of untouched nature, but the legacy of centuries of indigenous ecological management. This historical misunderstanding forces a critical rethinking of the pervasive wilderness myth. 16th-century colonial accounts of the eastern woodlands of North America frequently describe the landscape as an untouched Eden, a pristine wilderness devoid of human influence. This perspective fundamentally misinterpreted the environment, erasing the vital role human gatherers played in shaping the very abundance the colonists admired. The vibrant, untamed nature celebrated in those early historical texts was, in reality, deeply intertwined with human interaction and sustainable wildcrafting practices. Deconstructing the wilderness myth allows us to shift our understanding from the idea of a separate, pristine nature to a reality of deeply integrated, managed ecosystems. It reveals humanity's original relationship with the wild was not one of separation, but of active, harmonious participation. To visualize this level of integration, one must look to the historic Camas prairies of the Pacific Northwest, as they existed well before the widespread arrival of European settlers in the early 19th century. Picture a vast, sunlit meadow bordering a dense coniferous forest, painted in striking hues of violet and blue by thousands of blooming Camas flowers. To an untrained eye, this vibrant expanse appeared as a spontaneous miracle of nature, a wild and untouched paradise. Yet this meadow was the result of deliberate, generational tending by indigenous gatherers. The seemingly invisible hand of human stewards shaped these landscapes through the rhythmic, seasonal harvesting of the camas bulbs. Using specialized digging sticks, foragers selectively removed the mature bulbs for food and medicine, while intentionally leaving the smaller offshoots in the earth. This physical act of harvesting aerated the soil, acting as a gentle tilling process that encouraged greater proliferation of the plant. The meadow was not a wild occurrence, but a carefully managed, decentralized garden that relied on human interaction to maintain its breathtaking botanical diversity. Beyond selective harvesting, ancient foragers employed landscape-level tools to shape their environment, most notably the practice of cultural burning. Historical records from the coastal tribes of California, as well as the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, document the sophisticated use of low-intensity fires to manage vast tracts of land. These carefully timed, cool-burning fires were set during specific seasons when the wind and moisture levels were perfectly aligned, ensuring the flames crept slowly across the forest floor without damaging the mature canopy. This controlled application of fire served as a highly effective wildcrafting mechanism. The flames cleared away choked underbrush and dead vegetation, instantly returning vital nutrients like carbon and nitrogen to the soil in the form of ash. This sudden influx of fertility, combined with the clearing of the forest floor, stimulated the germination of fire-adapted medicinal plants, berry bushes, and staple food crops like oak trees. By mimicking natural disturbances, human gatherers actively engineered habitats that supported a far greater density of useful flora than a truly untouched forest could sustain. The ultimate consequence of these deeply integrated practices was an era of extraordinary, sustainable abundance. By actively participating in the ecological cycles of their local environments, human populations did not deplete their natural pharmacies, but rather expanded them. The land responded to this careful stewardship with increased yields, creating a resilient system where human survival and botanical flourishing were mutually dependent. For millennia, communities thrived within this paradigm of reciprocal care. The vast knowledge of indicator species, seasonal rhythms, and regenerative harvesting techniques allowed generations to draw their medicine and sustenance from the wild without ever exhausting the source. This long-term ecological stability stands as a testament to a time when humanity acted as a keystone species, actively enriching the biodiversity of the earth rather than simply extracting from it. However, this widespread, intimate ecological fluency eventually faced a devastating historical turning point, initiating what can be understood as the Great Forgetting. The fracture began in earnest during the 17th and 18th centuries, accelerating as European models of land ownership and agriculture expanded across the globe. The ancient understanding of the landscape as a shared living entity to be tended began to collide with a radically different worldview, one that saw the natural world as a wild frontier to be conquered and tamed. This shift marked the beginning of a rapid decline in traditional wildcrafting. As communal foraging lands were increasingly partitioned and enclosed, the daily physical interaction between humans and their local ecosystems was abruptly severed. The vast, decentralized forest gardens that had been nurtured for thousands of years were abandoned, replaced by an entirely new system of human survival that fundamentally altered the botanical landscape. The core of this transformation was the agrarian shift, defined by the rise of intensive stationary monoculture farming. Rather than moving with the seasons to harvest a diverse array of wild plants across various microclimates, populations became anchored to single plots of land, heavily cultivating a tiny selection of staple crops. The digging stick, which once aerated the soil of wild meadows, was replaced by the heavy plow, designed to tear up complex ecosystems and replace them with uniform fields. This agricultural revolution forced a complete recategorization of the plant kingdom. Vital wild medicinal plants that had sustained human health for generations, such as dandelion, burdock, and stinging nettle, were suddenly redefined as agricultural weeds. Because they competed with the newly prized monoculture crops for water and nutrients, these ancient healing plants became enemies of the farm, targeted for relentless eradication. As the 19th century progressed, this mechanical approach to nature extended directly into the realm of medicine, leading to the early standardization of pharmacology. The complex, holistic practice of community herbalism began to give way to early commercial apothecaries, which required uniform, easily transportable, and highly predictable crops. The focus shifted away from the nuanced, hyperlocal wildcrafted remedies toward standardized botanical commodities that could be cultivated on a massive scale. This transition fundamentally changed how plant medicine was understood and utilized. Early pharmacological science began to move away from the complex, whole-plant synergy that defined traditional herbalism, focusing instead on isolating single active compounds. The intricate chemistry of a wild-crafted herb, shaped by the unique stressors of its specific forest environment, was reduced to extractable ingredients, stripping away the holistic benefits that ancient foragers had relied upon. The consequence of this agrarian and early industrial shift was a drastic narrowing of the botanical diversity in the human diet and medicinal repertoire. Where ancient foragers regularly consumed and utilized hundreds of different wild plant species throughout the year, agrarian societies narrowed their reliance to a mere fraction of that number. The human body, which had evolved in tandem with a vast array of wild phytochemicals, was suddenly deprived of this complex botanical input. This loss of dietary and medicinal diversity left populations increasingly vulnerable. Without the broad spectrum of nutrients and immune-supporting compounds provided by a wild-crafted diet, the human microbiome lost its intimate connection to the local ecology. The resilience that came from consuming a deeply varied, seasonally rotating natural pharmacy was replaced by the fragility of a simplified, standardized food system. Beyond the physical vulnerabilities, this transition resulted in a deeply felt cultural severing from the natural world. The loss of daily foraging meant losing the quiet intimacy, the generational stories, and the spiritual reverence that once tied communities to their local landscapes. Gathering plants had never been merely a chore of caloric acquisition. It was a daily act of communion, a way of listening to the land and understanding one's place within the larger web of life. As the practice of wildcrafting faded from daily life by the late 19th century, a heavy silence fell over the human relationship with the wild. The ancient concept of plant teachers was largely forgotten, replaced by a utilitarian view of nature as a mere backdrop for human industry. Communities became spiritually orphaned from the very ecosystems that surrounded them, losing the vocabulary needed to read the seasonal changes and understand the subtle languages of the forest. This erasure of ancient ecological wisdom was not merely a passive side effect of modernization, but the result of the systemic forces of colonization. As colonial powers expanded, indigenous knowledge systems and complex land management practices were frequently misunderstood, dismissed as primitive, or actively suppressed. The intricate, sustainable methods of tending the wild simply did not align with the extractive economic goals of the expanding empires. Historical records show that traditional practices vital to wildcrafting were often explicitly outlawed. Cultural burning, long understood by indigenous groups as essential for forest health, was criminalized by early forestry agencies who viewed all fire as destructive. By systematically dismantling the ability of native populations to manage their ancestral lands, colonization actively severed the transmission of vital ecological knowledge, burying centuries of sustainable wisdom beneath the advancing tide of industrial agriculture. The English enclosure. Acts of the 18th and 19th centuries, alongside similar land privatization movements globally, erected physical and legal barriers across ancestral foraging grounds. Fences and property lines transformed the shared commons into private estates, legally barring rural communities from accessing the woodlands and meadows they had tended for generations. In North America, the forced relocation of indigenous peoples onto restricted reservation lands physically severed them from their traditional harvesting territories. Gathering ancestral foods and medicines outside these newly drawn boundaries was suddenly classified as trespassing or poaching, effectively criminalizing the ancient practice of wildcrafting and enforcing a strict separation between human communities and the wild. The immediate consequence of this physical separation was the disruption of generational knowledge transfer. Traditional ecological wisdom was rarely written down. It lived in the act of doing, passed from elder to child through the physical motions of identifying, harvesting, and processing plants in the field. Without the ability to freely walk the land and interact with the flora, the context for these teachings vanished. As the elders passed away, the intricate oral traditions that carried this localized botanical knowledge began to fade into obscurity. The names of plant teachers, the specific timing of harvests, and the nuanced understanding of microclimates were lost within a few short generations, leading to the near extinction of highly adapted herbal wisdom that had taken millennia to cultivate. The landscape itself bore witness to this sudden absence of human stewardship. Forests and meadows that had been carefully managed through selective harvesting and controlled burns quickly grew dense and unruly. Without the beneficial disturbances created by routine wildcrafting, such as the thinning of dominant canopy trees or the turning of soil by digging sticks, the ecological balance shifted dramatically. Sun-loving medicinal herbs and delicate understory plants were soon choked out by aggressive overgrown brush and an encroaching wave of invasive species. The wilderness, often romanticized by later generations as a pristine, untouched paradise, was in reality a neglected garden. It was a landscape suffering from the sudden withdrawal of its most active participants, growing increasingly vulnerable to disease and catastrophic wildfires without the tending hands of its traditional caretakers. As the commons closed, the Industrial Revolution delivered the final blow to widespread daily foraging. The 19th and 20th centuries saw vast populations migrate away from rural landscapes and into rapidly expanding urban centers to work in factories. This mass urbanization severed the daily physical reliance on local ecosystems for survival, replacing the rhythms of the seasons with the rigid schedules of industrial labor. In these new urban environments, local, wild-crafted remedies were systematically replaced by the convenience of mass-produced, commercialized pharmaceuticals. The complex, holistic understanding of plant medicine was distilled into isolated active compounds, manufactured in laboratories, and sold in standardized dosages. Health and nutrition were no longer matters of ecological engagement, but transactions conducted over a pharmacy counter. Even the practice of herbalism itself underwent a stark procedural shift, transforming from a deeply contextual community tradition into an alienated consumer industry. The act of gathering fresh, vibrant plants from a known local environment was replaced by a globalized supply chain. Consumers began purchasing dried, processed plant matter sealed in plastic bottles, entirely divorced from the soil, climate, and culture of its origin. This commercial model stripped away the essential rituals of ethical wildcrafting. A modern consumer buying a standardized echinacea tincture off a supermarket shelf has no way to observe the health of the plant population it was harvested from, nor the methods used to gather it. The reciprocal relationship between the gatherer and the gathered was completely erased, replaced by a purely extractive economic transaction. The culmination of this historical decline is a modern society that is largely blind to the living pharmacy growing just outside its doors. We walk past potent, resilient plants thriving in our own backyards, along hiking trails, and pushing through city sidewalk cracks, dismissing them merely as weeds. The intricate green tapestry of the natural world has been reduced to a uniform, unrecognizable blur. This botanical ignorance leaves communities entirely dependent on fragile, industrialized supply chains for their most basic nutritional and medicinal needs. By forgetting the names and uses of common plants like dandelion, plantain, and burdock, modern populations have forfeited a crucial layer of self-reliance. We are surrounded by natural abundance, yet we lack the cultural vocabulary to recognize or utilize it. Yet, the human impulse to connect with the wild was never entirely extinguished, and recent decades have witnessed a remarkable contemporary awakening. Beginning with the publication of books like Ewell Gibbon's Stalking the Wild Asparagus in the 1960s and accelerating rapidly in the 21st century, there has been a powerful resurgence of interest in ancestral skills. This modern revival is not merely a nostalgic hobby, but a growing hunger to reconnect with sustainable living principles in an increasingly synthetic world. From urban foraging tours in major metropolitan parks to rural workshops focused on ethical wildcrafting, individuals are actively seeking out the forgotten knowledge of their ancestors, driven by a deep-seated need to re-establish a tangible bond with the natural environment. This movement functions as a quiet but potent ecological rebellion against highly processed, industrialized food and medicine systems. Modern foragers are recognizing that the commercial supply chain often prioritizes shelf life and uniformity over nutritional density and environmental health. By turning back to the wild, they are attempting to reclaim personal agency over what they consume. Harvesting wild foods and medicines bypasses the agricultural-industrial complex entirely. It is a system of direct nourishment that requires no chemical fertilizers, no long-haul transportation, and no plastic packaging. For many contemporary practitioners, learning to identify and utilize wild plants is a foundational step in building local resilience and opting out of a globalized economy that frequently degrades the earth. Beyond the physical benefits of wild nutrition, this return to the woods offers immense psychological relief. In 2005, author Richard Louv coined the term nature deficit disorder to describe the human costs of alienation from the natural world, including diminished use of the senses and increased rates of anxiety. Foraging acts as a direct, engaging cure for this modern affliction, grounding the wandering mind in the immediate sensory reality of the forest floor. As individuals learn to recognize the leaves of a wild violet or the scent of crushed yarrow, the intimidating monolithic concept of the wilderness dissolves. The forest transforms from a generic backdrop of green into a familiar, welcoming community of recognizable allies. This process of relearning the landscape rekindles a deeply comforting sense of belonging, reminding the modern wanderer that they are not a stranger in nature, but an integral part of its enduring family. The journey to reclaim this forgotten herbal heritage requires a slow, meticulous process of re-education. Today, those seeking to harvest wild foods and medicines find themselves acting as amateur ethnobotanists, painstakingly cross-referencing historical texts with modern field guides and contemporary ecological science to piece together fragmented ancestral wisdom. This modern botanical education moves from the page to the soil, demanding countless hours of quiet observation. Novice gatherers learn to track the subtle life cycles of flora across shifting seasons, noting how microclimates dictate where specific species thrive and practicing the careful identification of toxic lookalikes. One immediate consequence of this rigorous field education is a radical shift in how modern foragers perceive common, resilient plants often dismissed as mere weeds. The ubiquitous dandelion, long targeted by chemical herbicides, reveals itself as a powerhouse of vitamins, while common plantain offers well-documented, historical soothing properties. Stinging nettle, fiercely guarded by its irritating trichomes, transforms from a woodland nuisance into a deeply nourishing spring green. By turning their attention to these abundant species, modern gatherers tap into a readily available source of vitality, proving that valuable natural resources often grow right beneath our feet. However, this contemporary resurgence carries a significant risk as the practice gains widespread popularity. Driven by rapid, highly visual social media trends, an influx of enthusiastic but uneducated individuals has entered wild spaces, creating a dangerous tension between a genuine desire to connect with nature and the threat of ecological depletion. When foraging is treated simply as a trendy outdoor grocery run rather than a relationship of reciprocity, vulnerable plant populations suffer. Novice gatherers, lacking a foundational understanding of regenerative harvesting techniques, often strip an area bare, removing the critical reproductive parts of slow-growing species. The consequences of this modern extraction are heavily documented in the severe depletion of highly sought-after wildcrafting staples. Wild American ginseng has faced decades of intense poaching and unethical, large-scale commercial harvesting across the Appalachian Mountains, while soaring commercial demand for white sage has led to devastating illegal harvests. In eastern deciduous forests, the brief spring emergence of wild leeks, commonly known as ramps, triggers an annual rush that frequently leaves hillsides barren. Commercial foragers often dig up the entire plant, entirely ignoring the ancient rules of restraint that dictate taking only a single leaf and leaving the root intact. The rapid depletion of these significant species has triggered an urgent reckoning within the modern foraging community. It has become critically clear that enthusiasm for wild foods must be strictly tempered by the rigorous ethical frameworks developed over millennia by indigenous cultures to protect these fragile ecosystems. At the core of this ethical reintegration is the revival of the traditional rule of fractions. This guiding principle dictates a gatherer must never take more than a small percentage of a given stand, ensuring that ample seed stock remains for future generations and local wildlife is not deprived. Recognizing the limitations of purely modern conservation models, a vital shift is occurring where contemporary science actively joins forces with ancestral knowledge. Over the past 2 decades, modern ecologists have begun formalizing partnerships with indigenous knowledge holders to restore sustainable harvesting practices on a much larger, landscape-level scale. These working groups bring together the precise measurement tools of modern botany with the deep, generational observation of traditional gatherers. Rather than viewing human presence as inherently destructive, these collaborative teams explore how historical methods of engagement might offer highly effective solutions to current ecological crises. Through these joint initiatives, traditional ecological knowledge, frequently referred to as tech, is achieving widespread recognition and formal validation within modern scientific circles. Researchers are discovering that the ancient rules governing when and how to harvest were rooted in highly sophisticated, long-term ecological principles. The historical concept of plant teachers, where traditional cultures learned directly from the observed behaviors of flora, is now being corroborated by peer-reviewed ecological data. Scientists are documenting how indigenous harvesting schedules perfectly coincide with the optimal periods for seed dispersal or root dormancy, maximizing species survival. To measure this efficacy, joint research teams have established specific field studies to document the precise impact of ancient harvesting methods on plant population genetics. Scientists and traditional gatherers work side by side to measure how the selective pruning of shrubs or the deliberate division of root systems affects resilience. One notable area of study involves the traditional harvesting of sweetgrass. Researchers compared plots that were entirely left alone against those harvested using ancestral methods of careful pinching and selective pulling, documenting that the plots subjected to traditional respectful harvesting actually thrived and expanded more robustly than untouched control groups. The consequence of these ongoing studies is a paradigm-shifting realization within conservation and ecology. The data proves that proper, ethical wildcrafting does not simply minimize harm to an environment, but can actually stimulate and enhance ecosystem health, acting as the essential natural disturbance many landscapes require to maintain biodiversity. This scientific confirmation shatters the modern assumption that humans are inherently a destructive force from which nature must be protected, offering instead a deeply hopeful vision of sustainable living. By embracing the disciplined, reciprocal practices of ancestral wildcrafting, individuals are proven capable of nurturing their ecosystems, transforming the act of gathering into an act of vital ecological healing. In the rolling Appalachian foothills of Ohio, the United Plant Savers Botanical Sanctuary, established in 1994, offers a living glimpse into a modern tended wild. Here, ancient wisdom directly guides contemporary conservation across hundreds of acres of recovering forest. Rather than fencing humans out, the sanctuary relies on respectful, active engagement to restore populations of at-risk medicinal plants. Visitors walking through this vibrant ecosystem do not see an untouched wilderness, but a carefully nurtured landscape. Human hands selectively thin canopy covers to let dappled sunlight reach the forest floor, creating the ideal microclimates for native golden seal and black cohosh to flourish. This active stewardship demonstrates that a healthy, biodiverse environment often requires the deliberate reciprocal participation of the people who rely on it. Translating this large-scale ecological validation into daily life requires moving beyond the boundaries of rural sanctuaries. By the early 2020s, a surge of urban foraging initiatives in cities like Seattle and London began teaching residents how to integrate this ancestral philosophy into their own neighborhoods. The goal of these programs is not to strip city parks of their greenery, but to teach individuals how to read the landscape just outside their doors. Bringing this wisdom home means recognizing that the principles of ethical wildcrafting apply as much to a suburban backyard or a community garden as they do to an old-growth forest. It is a daily pursuit of sustainable living that asks individuals to observe the seasonal cycles of their immediate surroundings before ever taking a leaf or a root. This localized attention slowly dismantles the modern illusion that nature is a distant place meant only for weekend visits. Engaging with the local environment in this way triggers a necessary psychological shift, transforming an individual from a passive consumer into an active participant. In a conventional commercial model, a person simply purchases a standardized botanical product, completely detached from the soil, labor, and ecological cost of its creation. Ethical foraging demands the opposite, requiring the gatherer to understand the life cycle of the plant and the health of the soil it grows in. This participant worldview recognizes that humans are not separate from the food web, but deeply embedded within it. When a person harvests a plant with their own hands, they assume direct responsibility for the regeneration of that species and the preservation of the surrounding habitat. Gathering becomes an act of relationship building, where the health of the human is inextricably linked to the ongoing vitality of the local ecosystem. This localized approach to wellness is the foundation of bioregional herbalism, a practice that gained modern traction in the Pacific Northwest during the 1990s. Bioregional herbalism is the ethical practice of utilizing abundant, native, and naturalized plants that grow immediately around you, rather than seeking out exotic remedies shipped across the globe. It prioritizes the ecology of a specific region, adapting human needs to what the landscape naturally provides in abundance. In practice, this means identifying and harvesting common weedy species, like dandelion, broadleaf plantain, or aggressively invasive Japanese knotweed, for everyday wellness. By focusing on these prolific growers, practitioners actively manage invasive populations, while leaving slow-growing, endangered native plants entirely alone. The practical steps involve learning the specific botanical profile of one's own watershed, turning a perceived nuisance into a sustainable resource. The immediate consequence of this bioregional focus is a drastic reduction in the ecological footprint of natural medicine. Relying on local, abundant species eliminates the carbon emissions associated with global shipping and supply chains. More importantly, it removes the commercial pressure from vulnerable wild species in other parts of the world, protecting delicate ecosystems from the ravages of overharvesting driven by international trends. Beyond environmental protection, this approach fosters a deep, hyperlocal resilience within modern communities. When neighborhoods learn to identify and utilize the nutritional and supportive properties of the plants growing in their own soil, they become less dependent on fragile global supply chains. This self-reliance weaves a safety net of botanical knowledge that can endure economic fluctuations and environmental shifts. The long-term consequence of adopting this localized, reciprocal approach is a powerful sense of ecological belonging. When people can name the plants along their daily commute and understand their historical uses, the landscape ceases to be a green blur and becomes a familiar, legible community. This enduring ecological literacy cures the modern epidemic of environmental alienation. By interacting with the natural world as a dynamic living system rather than a static backdrop, individuals anchor themselves in the specific, comforting rhythms of their home terrain. Applying the ancient rules of wildcrafting to modern consumption introduces the philosophy of the honorable harvest into everyday decision-making. This ethical framework dictates that one must never take the first plant they see, nor the last, and must always assess the health of the patch before gathering. While originally applied to the forest, this mindset changes how a family approaches all forms of consumption, from a local farmer's market to a neighborhood garden. It instills a culture of restraint and gratitude, ensuring that human needs are met without compromising the ability of the land to regenerate. This shift in perspective naturally extends into actionable ways to give back to the local environment, as seen in the rise of community seed scattering networks throughout 2023. These groups actively replant native medicinals and pollinators in degraded urban spaces, ensuring that their harvesting is always balanced by an equal act of restoration. Daily acts of ecological reciprocity become second nature, whether it is tending a neglected patch of soil, leaving seed heads intact for wintering birds, or removing invasive vines from a neighborhood park. These small, consistent actions prove that humans can actively contribute to the flourishing of their local habitats. Yet, as this ancestral knowledge experiences a modern renaissance, it raises an unresolved question about the future of the planet. It remains to be seen whether these localized, intimate practices of ethical wildcrafting can be scaled up to meet the demands of a rapidly growing global population. The historical record proves that these methods successfully sustained complex societies for millennia, but modern civilization operates on an unprecedented scale. The lingering mystery is whether this ancient blueprint for human survival can adapt to the pressures of the 21st century without losing the very reverence that makes it sustainable. The ecological niche of humanity was never meant to be inherently destructive. Traditional wildcrafting models reveal a system where people function as active, necessary caretakers rather than conquerors, intricately woven into the web of local habitats. This shift in perspective is actively reshaping contemporary conservation frameworks. Institutional land management programs are increasingly adopting indigenous-led harvesting protocols, recognizing that carefully calibrated human intervention can actually accelerate the restoration of native plant populations. The stakes of maintaining this ancient botanical literacy extend far beyond the preservation of cultural heritage. There is a direct, documented correlation between the survival of traditional ecological knowledge and the preservation of global biodiversity. When elders pass without transmitting their regional foraging lexicons, the human aftermath is immediate and tangible. Communities lose a localized safety net of food and natural medicine, leaving succeeding generations increasingly vulnerable to the disruptions of industrialized supply chains. Despite centuries of ecological severing, the natural world maintains an enduring, quiet patience. The seeds of historically vital plants often lie dormant beneath layers of modern development, quietly waiting for the return of hands that remember how to tend them. This resilient reality fundamentally alters the modern assumption that wilderness is a fragile artifact requiring strict human isolation. Instead, it offers a deeply comforting truth, revealing that the earth is not a closed museum, but a living community eager to welcome its caretakers back into the fold. Stepping back into the woodland canopy, the once tangled understory transforms into a legible, familiar landscape. Every shadow and sunlit clearing now reads as a distinct ecological grammar, revealing the intricate relationships between soil, shade, and the native roots quietly thriving beneath the surface. Yet, a critical question remains unanswered by both historical records and contemporary ecological studies: whether highly urbanized societies can genuinely scale this intimate, localized reciprocity without ultimately commercializing and depleting the very wild spaces they are just beginning to relearn. The enduring legacy of wildcrafting wisdom is now taking root in modern community foraging charters, where local groups legally protect and sustainably harvest specific woodland tracts. This quiet cultural shift transforms passive observers into active, responsible stewards of their immediate ecosystems. A single yarrow stalk, left standing to seed in a sunlit clearing, serves as a quiet testament to this ancient pact, a living reminder that true abundance blossoms when we learn to take only what we need.